And we do want to record, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, let's record.
Better, yeah.
All right, everyone, we're going to start in about 30 seconds to a minute. We're just waiting for the rest of the attendees to come on board.
There we go.
Probably a good idea if we started off. Good evening, everyone. I believe everyone can probably see our screens. There's 5 individuals that you can probably see on your screen, and we have a handful of attendees. And so with this, if apologize for that. So with this, if come this evening is Arnoldo Rodriguez. I'm the city manager for the city of Madera. We have Mark Sodders, who's our information technology department director here at the city. We have Gabby Salazar, who's an admin analyst, Joseph Carrillo, who's our public information officer, and then we also have David McPherson with HDL, who's the city's consultant on the cannabis item. What we are going to attempt to do this evening, I have a couple of slides that I would like to share with the community this evening to provide some context to the issue of cannabis. And then after that, we will follow that up with a brief presentation from David. David can go into his credentials a bit as well, but I believe there are about 120 plus cannabis ordinances in different jurisdictions in the state of California. And if memory serves me, David, I believe, has prepared 77. So David is a subject matter expert in the state of California. He has a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience, and he's both worked for on the public sector side, working for local governments, and he's also worked in the private side, and he's currently on the private side with a firm named HDL. This is being recorded. So in case that there are questions that we cannot get to, we will be following up with individuals, and we will attempt to post those online, or we'll have direct contact with those individuals that are providing those. So what we would like to do this evening is go through our presentation. Again, we are going to try to provide as much background and details as we can, knowing that we're not going to cover everything. And after our presentations, what we would like to do is open it up for Q&A. On the bottom of your screen, you will have around the middle of it, it says raise your hand. What we'll do at that point, we will invite the participants to ask their questions. So we would unmute you. And at that point, you would be able to speak. We will attempt to answer every question that we can. For some reason, if we cannot, what we'll attempt to do is we'll attempt to follow up with you. So with that, I'm going to share my screen now, and we will begin. So again, to preface the item this evening, today's the first of 3 informational workshops that we'll be having with the community. The next workshop is going to be in Spanish, and the goal behind the Spanish workshop is oftentimes when you have workshops such as these are a bit challenging, especially because they're on Zoom. And unfortunately, we can't have them in a public setting because of COVID-19. And then we'll follow that up with an English one. However, even though we only have 3 scheduled, if there's any community members or groups that would like to meet individually, we would be more than happy to meet with anyone on either one-on-one. We'd be more than happy to have another Zoom meeting. So if there are questions that arise out of this, or if there's any groups that you believe that we should touch base with, I would implore you or any groups or committees to please feel free to reach out to city staff, and we would be more than happy to accommodate everyone. The meeting tonight, it's an information session. This is not a public hearing in the traditional sense. This is being led by city staff and our consulting team. So again, there's no action that's anticipated this evening. Again, it's information only. And the other item is that the city will not campaign either for or against Measure R. There are state statutes that strictly outline what cities can and cannot do. So again, the city is not going to expend any funding or any efforts to either persuade or to dissuade how voters vote in the general election, specifically on Measure R. Our goal is to provide information so that the community can make an informed decision. And again, this evening speaking at this workshop is myself as a city manager, and then we also have David with HDL Consulting. There's a couple of items that we should probably simply go over. Some of these items, I believe some of the folks here with us this evening are already aware of this. However, the city has historically prohibited cannabis businesses to operate within the city. And that's either for cultivation purposes, for delivery services, or for retail or testing or manufacturing or processing. So again, the city currently does not permit any type of cannabis related industry. With that being said, the state has allowed cannabis businesses in the state of California. However, a local jurisdiction must also permit them. So the state of California says, yes, you can, subject to local approval. And the city right now does not have any. So in order to explore different options and different avenues, we did retain HDL in June, if memory serves me, to provide some potential options for the city. There are many different paths to get there, and the path that the city elected to take was to put it on the ballot. And the reason you put something on the ballot is to tax it. The alternative to the ballot measure would be to have a development agreement, which some communities do, and at that point that would not go to the voters. In this particular, in our approach, we thought it would be best to take it to the voters. And again, the first step would be to place it on the ballot. Depending on how the voters vote, if the voters approve it, we would begin to develop a regulatory ordinance. And then the regulatory ordinance is the ordinance that actually stipulates how and the where and the processing of potential applications would be processed. So the ordinance that was submitted to the voters for consideration, the maximum number of words is 75 words, and it's very specific. So if someone were to read it and say, why did the city word it like this? A lot of that is, there are state guidelines that outline how you structure sentences or how you word it. And so so if it feels a little bit awkward, or if it sounds a little awkward, we apologize for that. But we tried taking some standard, some common language found in other jurisdictions. We weren't trying to make it confusing, but what we were trying to do is make sure that we can fit it within 75 words. And the ordinance that's being considered by the voters, so the measure outlines the maximum amounts that can be charged by the cannabis business license tax. However, a local jurisdiction can establish lower thresholds, and David will get into that in a few minutes here. So with that, we do have 3 scheduled informational workshops. Again, I would ask that if anyone wants to meet separate from any of these workshops, feel free to reach out. We have a website that's dedicated to Measure R, which is madera.gov/measure-R. You can email us at measurer@madera.gov, or you can call 661-5488. And if you have my contact information, you can directly reach out to me. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to David, and David will begin his presentation. And again, at the end, we will open it up for Q&A. So David?
Thank you, Arnaldo. And just for clarification, if folks went to the website, will they be able to find the ordinance in its entirety? I know you indicated the 75 words, but that link is the ordinance there for the review for if they wanted to see the whole ordinance.
Yes, thank you, David. The entire ordinance is on our website, and all of the documents that we've presented to the City Council to date, those are also available on the website. As information becomes available, we will be posting that on the website as well. So the website, it's intended to be a living website where it's updated with all the most recent information. So the goal is to not have a stale website, so people can have confidence in knowing that whenever they go to that's the most recent and up-to-date information that's available. Thank you, David.
You're welcome. Okay, well, thank you for letting me be with you tonight, and I'm trying to just give you an understanding of what Measure R does and what it doesn't do. So kind of an outline of what it is. The first thing I wanted to do, so we talk about taxing different categories. I think it would be important to understand just quickly of the categories so you know what they are. And then we'll talk about the difference between fees and taxes, because there's a lot of questions that are asked of, well, will the taxes be used for fees or to pay for things? And then why we have a process of looking at it from a strategic standpoint of why the rates we did put together, and then also what technology and future trends are doing with that. Then we'll address an overview of the proposed tax ordinance, and then actually what that means in the cumulative tax rate since we went into a regulated world, and then next steps. So the first thing that we want to look at is, looks like these might be out of order. But the first thing we want to look at is revenue strategies. And the tax in general is why it is. And this is a tax, Measure R is a tax which is a general tax. It's solely for government purposes. It's not specific or specified for a certain category. It's used for general funds based on the policymaker's decision what it wants to be used for in your community. We were looking at proactive revenue strategies, which will provide the city flexibility to address various things. 4 or 5 years ago, we only had medicinal cannabis. Now we have adult use, so it's a variation. But we also want to be mindful that if there's any illegal activity in the city and you're trying to shut them down, we kind of call this the Al Capone rule, where you can't get them for, on one side from administratively, but you go after them for tax evasion, and that helps you kind of address taking care of the illegal activity. So it's worded to address that. And then there's legislative changes. As you can see, we mentioned vaping laws. So if you wanted to address that in a taxing component, then there's flexibility in that. And we're going to dig a little deeper into the delivery question, because there are lots of cities that tax this just for the purpose of out-of-town deliveries to make sure that they can capture those revenues if they're coming into town. And then we'll touch base a little bit on future trends, and that's hemp, and that's kind of the brother of cannabis that's popping up, and we'll go into a little detail about that. The goal of a tax measure, though, should be, if the city chooses to have it and the community wishes to vote it in, is that it would be successful in collaboration with the industry so that it is taxed where it's equitable for both the city of getting the proper amount of revenue, but also the businesses that they can be sustainable and create an opportunity for them. So I mentioned about understanding the license types. So we're going to kind of chat about that a little bit so you understand why there's different tax rates and why there's different reasons of the activities that we're trying to make sure we clearly tax and don't leave any loopholes. So this is kind of a chart of the line of the process of it. There's a cultivation tax, and cultivation means actually growing. And in your case, most probability that it's going to be indoors in commercial locations, if that even occurs at all. Council may consider not having any of these categories. And again, these are not that you're going to have them. It's should there be a decision made to have cannabis in your community, that we're just really focusing on the tax rates for the purposes of this evening as well. So manufacturing is done in many ways. You might see manufacturing that is where there's oils being made from extraction machines, but then you might have manufacturers that do have nothing with oils, and they could just be making cookies and brownies and other products that are sold at retail stores. And then they all have to be tested. Some of them are, you see that first testing lab, they can be voluntary tested, but more importantly, there's a testing component to this to make sure the product is safe, just like the FDA or the Public Health Department. And so before it can actually go to market to be sold at retail, the distributor, and the distributor is a business that just moves the product from one license to the retailer. And so there's a middleman moving this process and not the business themselves. And then it goes to the retailer, in which it's sold to the consumer. So that's an oversight of just the types of activities that we're going to talk about in the tax ordinance. So I wanted to mention the fees versus the tax, because I think that's important. We've had some conversations where people blend the two in there. So on the fee side, just as you would have for your water or gas or uses of the community pools or recreation services, you set fees based for a unit cost for whatever the cost of that is. It's the same here. Should the city move forward to allow the businesses, they will be required to have permits. So there would be initial permits for applications, but they would do a cost analysis of how that affects staff, how it affects the community, any resources that are involved with it, any work that has to be done with it. You will charge them fees for that. It will not come from the taxes. And I want to emphasize that. So you will be made 100% whole for the oversight or anything involvement from the fees. Now with the tax, when the ballot measure goes, and should it pass, it is said again to be a general tax, which means it only has to have 50% plus one person in order to be a general tax and used for general purposes. So what that is, again, as we mentioned, is that those fees can be, the tax for that will be used based on policy direction for city services. That would be a discussion regarding the revenues coming in associated with that. You do not have to use the taxes to oversee the industry. As we mentioned, you have the fees to cover that. The tax will be for hopefully services that will be for the community. So just want to make sure we're clear and have an understanding of that. So the future trends, I mentioned about one of the future trends of being hemp, the brother or sister of cannabis. So you probably see stuff on the internet, or you go to stores, or even Costco or Walgreens or GNC stores. They have hemp products in there, because currently hemp products can be sold only from seeds of hemp. But if it's actually sold from the oils of the flowers from that, it still has less than 1% product, but you will see that. And should some of those pop up in your community or be a business model that people wish to look at, you will have it in this tax measure, as it's stated in the measure tax and hemp, so that you can make sure that you can generate the revenues associated with that. And that is something that we anticipate starting to happen in other states in the Midwest and working its way here. But the federal law has changed to not make it an illegal or a controlled substance at the federal level now. So we anticipate that being in California in the future. So you will have a tax measure that will be forward thinking on that. So the reason I say part of that, again, here's some of the bills that have come before our governor legislatively with COVID. There's been some timeout addressed associated with that. And then the Sherman Food and Drug Act with some modifications in that, and thus will change where it comes in the future in California. So now I want to talk about the ordinance, and this is the proposed ordinance because it's bringing back in front of you as a voter to decide if this is something that's going to be adopted. But ordinances, this ordinance will cover just about everything new. The purpose, authority to tax, the purpose of the tax, the intent of the tax. And the emphasis added is that the purpose is that this is a tax on the businesses, not on consumers. And we specifically clarify that so that it cannot be imposed on you. We clearly define the definitions of what is going to be in this and clarify where people don't try to create loopholes, but try to not have the tax imposed on them. And it covers everything, regardless of the city does it or not, or allows it or not. And then general stuff, just like a business tax that's required it. And for comfort zones, council wanted to make sure there was the ability to audit and examine their records, make sure there's transparency and that the businesses are clearly paying their taxes and not trying to hide anything. And as you know, because of COVID, a lot of businesses are being impacted by this. We have fires on some of them. They're having to shut down because of COVID. So one of the reasons we put a disaster relief in there is to recognize that and acknowledge that there could be some situation that could come up again. And then the most important thing is nothing's perfect and changing. So we have amendments and modifications in the ordinance that allows the council to make adjustments as there might be some need clarity or defined issues that need to come up, or to increase the tax or reduce the tax. However, emphasis added, they cannot increase the tax no higher than what you approve in a ballot. So should the council bring a tax down for some reason for a short period of time, or exempt medicinal cannabis for a short period of time, and they wish to bring it back up to the rate what the voters approved, they can do that without having to go back to the voters, but at no time can they go higher than what you approved it for. So the rate of the tax. The important goal of the rate of the tax is to have it high enough to generate proceeds to make it a value added to offset costs in the community, but also derive some benefit to you. But low enough, again, to avoid overtaxing a business, because the tax has gone significant. We'll demonstrate some of that in the cumulative tax discussion that we have at the end. But you also want to kind of look what's happening around you in other communities as they're modifying tax or changing taxes to make sure you can be competitive should you have businesses in town and want to make sure that they can be sustainable. And then a flexibility of market conditions. As we talk about, COVID changes some of the market conditions, economy changes market conditions. And we mentioned some of the things already about the increase and decrease, looking at inflation, setting minimum, maximum rates, and making sure that we're taxing all the activities that are out there. So I shared with you, for one, is that we have a lot of clients that put a tax measure out there and don't have any cannabis businesses out there, because the one thing that's assured is that there are deliveries happening in town. So by having a tax in place, even should you not move forward with having cannabis businesses in town, that out-of-town deliveries, the tax will be imposed on them, so that you derive some benefit from that by having this tax measure in place, because you are now have the opportunity to tax them should they come in town. Because you legally right now, the state regulations specify that you cannot prohibit out-of-town deliveries from coming into town. So this gives you the mechanism to generate revenue from that if you have nothing but this for the tax measure. So looking at the rates. So we set the rates in twofold. One is the cultivation we've scheduled and put on here at a square footage rate, because it requires less oversight on the business. And I say oversight, not from a regulatory, but just on a calculation base of trying to generate the revenue. And from a budget standpoint, the finance director can say, okay, we have X amount, we have one or two businesses that have X square footage. It's easy for them to forecast in a budget of what they are going to generate from those businesses versus on a gross receipts that can go up and down and doesn't have a constant in there. So this does a few of those things. And also businesses can't try to reduce their gross receipts for their business by trying to move it to one of the other locations out of town. So that is part of the reasons why we have a square footage on the cultivation side of it. Now, even though I mentioned earlier that, maybe there not be outdoor cultivation allowed in town. Again, we talked about people that might be illegally growing outdoors in town, and this gives you the opportunity to tax it and making sure that you're being able to have an enforcement mechanism indirectly by at least taxing it. Then the other categories we had talked about, testing laboratories have a lower rate because of the fact that this is one of those essential things. It would be like you having to go get your blood test, right? You want to make sure the quality of the product going to consumers in your community is appropriate, and therefore this is one of those businesses that are essential, that they're just helping out and don't have the same profit margins as some of the other ones. So why that tax rate is lower. On the retail side, it is higher profitability because there's less retailers and other types of businesses. There's only 641 currently in the state of California. And 5 years ago, there was 2,800 retailers when it was in a co-op and collective world before regulations were in place. So you can see where they have a lot more flexibility and less competition. So the tax rates can be a little higher. The distribution also has a slightly lower rate because, again, it's one of those essential requirements to move the product from one licensee to another. They don't have the same profit margins as a retailer or a manufacturer or even the cultivators. That's why we put the price points associated with them. And you can see there's a slight tick in the manufacturing tax rate to provide that for you. So I'd like to share with you why that looks the way it is. So these are the recommended rates that we are suggesting as an initial rate. It doesn't mean it's the maximum, as you will see in the tax measure. The tax measure provides you the top rates, which we will talk about. But I wanted to show you on the cumulative why that is important to have certain rates the way they are. The state from Prop 64 is automatically going to tax the businesses at 25%. What we have discovered as across from an industry, the cumulative tax in which the industry can really sustain as a business is 30%. So you will see at the very bottom of this slide, the 29.49% is because as you add the tax, which we've got highlighted here, accumulative to the different processes, they have to go from the cultivator to the testing, to the manufacturer, to the distributor, to the retailer, is that gets to a point where it's a lot of taxes on an industry that's regulated and heavily regulated as well. On the back end of this, these are the recommended rates as a starting point, but we give it flexibility. Is on the tax measure, we have the maximum rates. And the maximum rates gives you that ability that high end, but you can see where that high rate gets us over that 30%. And that's why it's important to look at each different activity that from a different level for a different reason of why those tax rates are differently for each type of business based on what we call those pain points of what they can afford to pay and contribute and be sustainable at the same time. So that's the high and the low, but you can understand why the tax rate's different for different tax activities. So in the tax measure, as Arnaldo had mentioned, is that we have 75 words. And in that 75 words, we give a range of what the revenue potential would be. So we wanted to share with you of why that revenue could occur. And these are just assumptions that should you consider actually having businesses in town in the future. And it varies, by activity and by the numbers. And so we wanted to kind of show you what that would do. If on a very conservative number, and we say conservative even though there's more numbers, is because the more businesses you have, there's going to be a lower opportunity for them on the revenue side because they have to compete with other businesses. And so you can see the range of dollars. We look on what the average of those businesses would be, but also the potential of them. And it'll vary from the type of activity that may occur of those types of businesses that there. But with that said, with those assumptions of a reasonable amount of business from 3 to 6, not an overkill. It could be more, it could be less down the road, or again, it could be 0 of businesses that come into town or be allowed. This is the revenues that we put on there in the tax measure ballot language of 75 words, so you can see where that reasonableness is, that we think is a comfortable zone without being unrealistic. So next steps. So as Arnaldo mentioned, we have another measure outreach like this one tonight that will be conducted by one of my colleagues in Spanish on the 14th. And the day after that, we will have potentially the final measure our outreach scheduled for October 15th, which has been announced and posted and continue to be there. And then on the measure on November 3rd, you as a community get to vote on the tax measure. And we encourage you to do that or to be more educated, informed about what it's all about. And then if and only if the tax measure passes by the voters, it will be in effect on January 1st, 2021, if approved by you, the voters. And then you will have an ordinance adopted in there. So if you did nothing else or council decided not to move anything else than this, you get 2 things out of this. 1, any deliveries coming into town will now be taxed and impose a tax on them. Any illegal activity that occurs and you want to shut it down because you don't want it there, you can impose a tax on them because this measure will do that. So those are 2 positive things at a minimum that will be able to be done. And with that said, that is the end of this. And at this time, if we have any questions, then we'd be more happy to answer them. And we will turn this back over to the city manager.
Thank you, David. So just to touch on something that both I talked about and David talked about, that we definitely don't expect the community to just know off the top of their head. But there's a couple of different moving parts to this process. Again, how I said earlier, there's a couple of different avenues to take. So if you take a look at, for example, the city of Parlier took a different approach. They are doing a development agreement. That's one approach, and there's nothing wrong with that approach. The approach that the city of Madera took was to allow the voters to have a voice if you want to tax it. Again, different communities take different approaches. So in this approach, the choice is going to be up to the voters to tax it. If the voters decide to pass it, at that point, the city still has to do another part or another process. And that process would entail doing a zoning code that's going to stipulate or it's going to outline what should the city allow and how it should go about allowing it and how many. So that process has not commenced. And so that's another process. And at that point, there would be more community meetings. There would be public outreach meetings exactly like we're doing here tonight. I'm not too sure if they'll be over Zoom or if they'll be in a public setting. Some of that's going to be dependent on the pandemic, but there's going to be more opportunities for that. And at that point, that's when we would be discussing, should the city allow distribution? Should the city allow retail sales? Should the city allow testing? Again, the first step in this process is to see if the voters want to tax it. And again, that's it's a majority vote. So it's 50% plus 1 is what it takes to pass the measure. And if it doesn't pass, and then we move on. And I'm confident that the elected officials will probably say, okay, the voters spoke and they don't want to allow it. So with that, is there anything else that you would like to chime in on, David, or are we okay before we turn it over to questions?
Yeah, no, I think you covered it all. I'm more happy to answer questions.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to the attendees. And if the attendees have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. No pressure. If you would like to reach out to either David or myself after the meeting directly, you are more than welcome to do so. I would encourage folks to reach out. So the first question, I'm going to read it out loud for the benefit of the group because I'm not certain if everyone can see it. I do not believe you can. It says, with cannabis/hemp not recognized at a federal level, I understand there are issues with the handling of funds/banks. Would this pose any issues on the city level? David, would you like to take that?
Sure, yeah. So it's not that banks can't handle cash funds. It has to go through a more stringent oversight for compliance for that. There are over 400 banks and credit unions and state banks that allow both cannabis businesses to be in their banks, and also pretty much every city in California or in county that is doing cannabis or hemp is able to put money in the bank. There is a code, a FinCEN code that talks about 8300 that talks about if you are a business or profession, you're required to do a SARS report on reporting of cash. The city is neither a business or a profession, it is government. It's taking fiduciary funds and taxes and submitting it into and putting it into the bank. So the city doesn't have so much of an issue with it. Banks may be reluctant to do business with cannabis business, thus we see the cash. But I was on a task force meeting with the CDFA, which is the former state board of equalization. And in that meeting, they indicated 2 years ago, they were almost at 80 to 90% cash of being paid for their excise taxes. And as of the June meeting, they are actually only at 30% of having to receive cash for payment of taxes and fees. So that's a significant change and moving in the right direction.
To the attendee, did we answer your question thoroughly? And if not, can feel free to follow up. And you're more than welcome to follow up here or after the meeting is appropriate as well. And the attendee responded, yes, thank you. So, Council, thank you for your question. Are there any other questions from any of the attendees?
Also, if you're listening by phone, you can hit *9 on your phone to raise your hand and we will recognize you and you can speak.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So as of right now, I am not seeing any additional hands raised. So we definitely don't have to be labored. So we received a couple of more questions. It says, has tax money been earmarked for departments? So as of right now, the money has not been earmarked for any specific use. That is a discussion that the city council will take up. There are a couple of different opportunities. When it comes in, the money could simply go into the general fund, and then the general fund would be divided annually at the discretion of the city council. An example of that is just like any other sales tax measure, with the exception of Measure K. So if you have a sales tax in the city, we receive the money, and then at that point we go through an internal process, and that internal process is presented to the city council, and the city council has ultimate authority with how every dollar in the city is spent. In this particular case for Measure R, the city council has not identified exactly where that money goes. However, I'm confident that if Measure R is passed by the voters, we will have an opportunity to sit down and discuss it. The other side is, the other question could be, is why hasn't that process taken place now? And the process has not taken place when we started having that discussion. There was some discussion about doing that now versus doing it later. And at the time, we elected to place it on the ballot. And I'm confident that discussion will be had. Again, it is a general fund. So the city council can elect to put it for police and for police services, for fire, for future parks, to address specific needs in the organization. For example, it could be river bottom cleanup, it could be animal control. At that point, it would be up to the city council. Another question is, why is the city asking to tax a commodity that is not even going that is not going to sell? I believe is grow, distribute, or purchase in city limits. Please confirm, didn't the voters vote no in the last election to cannabis?
Arnaldo, it looks like it says that it's not even legal to sell.
That is not even, okay, thank you. So in the 2016 election, I believe the city of Madera voters voted 47% on no to Proposition 64. No, I'm sorry, it was 53% said no to Proposition 64, and 46% of the voters said yes to Proposition 64. So in the city of Madera back in 2016, the majority of the voters voted no on Proposition 64. One of the trends right now, if you start looking at some of the communities around us, for example, Fresno is in the process of allowing cannabis shops. Merced, I believe Merced has 5 open, if not there's 4, and there's a 5th one on the way. So there are some communities around us that are beginning to allow for it. And when the discussion was had at council, it was the council elected to take it to the voters to see if there's been a change of opinion. And that's what we're doing here as part of Measure R. The other item is, I'm going to attempt to answer the second part of the question, is that it's currently not legal in the city. And you're absolutely correct. It is not legal as we speak. The first step is to establish a tax, and that's going to provide us with an excellent indication of what the voters of Madera would like to see. If the voters of Madera pass it, approve of Measure R by majority vote, at that point, the city council would sit down along with David and city staff and our city attorney, and we would devise some form of code or policy to allow for it. And that goes back to what David was talking about earlier. The question becomes is, should the city allow cultivation, retail services, distribution, testing, manufacturing, and all? And the city council at that point can elect to allow one and not another, or they can elect to permit all of them. That has yet to be decided, but we felt that the best approach for the city of Madera is to put it to the voters to see if it's something that the voters want to establish a tax on. So again, there are different ways to look at it. I'm not going to say there's any one right way or wrong way, but we felt that this was most appropriate for the city to leave it up to the voters. David, did you have any comments on anything that I just asked or said?
No, the only thing I wanted to comment is, as you mentioned, we're at a different place in time and when Prop 64 came out, people didn't know what that meant. Now that people are more educated, there's a different understanding of it. It's regulated, it's legal. We have a better understanding of what it means in our current environment. And there are communities, as you indicated, that the whole county of Imperial County, we use as an example, all voted, did not support 64, yet all those cities and counties have moved forward with a cannabis or a tax measure in today's environment. So we're at a different place in time, and that's kind of, we're asking the voters at a different place in time now to at least start with the tax. If the tax is passed, then that gives an indicator that there may be some support to have discussion on it, further discussion on it. If they don't, then council has to decide, knowing what the voters say.
Thank you. Another question, will you be providing pros and cons on the effects on our community? So David, do you want to take a stab at that?
I think that's more in the discussion if council decides to move forward with regulating it, and that would be a more appropriate place to do it, because then there would be a full, and I need to remind you today's, because we're talking about Measure R. We can't talk about something that we have no direction. The goal is to do outreach today of what the tax does, and clear understanding what the type of activities are, not so much trying to discuss policy of something that may or may not happen until actually the tax is passed.
Okay. Another question, why wasn't the measure worded, would you like cannabis business? Yes or no? David, would you like to take that one?
Again, it's a wordsmithing as far as there are legalities, requirements, measure of how it's worded, how you present it, and what needs to be in it. So this was an attorney's final wordsmith, and as Leonardo said, there's a whole lot of them that are out there, and everyone want to change how it's worded, but they go back to how we have to legally present it.
Yeah, and so to the attendee that asked that question, these are a lot of internal discussions that we had. My very simple way of thinking was the same thing. I'm like, why can't we just ask people yes or no? Seems pretty straightforward to me. But there are a lot of state guidelines that outline a measure, and so it goes back to what David said. There is a lot of legalese that stipulates how a local jurisdiction can ask it, and that's what we had to follow. Are there any other questions that any of the attendees would like to ask? So as people are thinking about it, there are currently no open questions. I will state, if there are any questions between today and the election, I would ask that you reach out to the city directly. Again, we do have our website that's dedicated to that. We do have an email address that goes to an individual. We have you can reach out to me directly. We would be more than happy to sit down with anyone to go over it. Again, the city is not going to expend any resources on either promoting it, campaigning for it, or against it. Rather, the goal of tonight and the future meetings is to go out and to provide information so the community can be informed. Another question, how has local enforcement made any report on, has local enforcement made any reports on this? Are those available? Will they be part of the next workshop? David actually has a background in law enforcement, and you've worked in a lot of different jurisdictions. Do you have any thoughts on this, David?
Yeah, I was a former deputy sheriff and a police officer at 2 different agencies before working in administration. Again, and we appreciate that, and I think those are good questions like the other one. Those are discussions regarding should the city move forward with a regulatory side, where I think the chief and his staff will play a role in that conversation, and the policy side as they're actually regulating. A tax is a tax. Like we talked about, it poses a tax to try to go after illegal activity if you wish to shut them down. It's a tax to impose a tax on deliveries that come in town that you can't legally stop. And it's a tax potentially to tax activities should it be the desire of the community and the policymakers to regulate it in town. And so a tax is separate from the regulatory side, where I think public safety plays a big part in.
Yeah, thank you. And so to add to that, our police department is going to be heavily involved. If the voters do approve Measure R, when we begin to develop the regulatory scheme, the police department will be heavily involved with making sure that any place, regardless if it's for retail sales, if it's for distribution or whatever it may be for, at that point, we'll sit down to make sure that we have as many measures as we can to try to mitigate any potential issues that may arise. But again, it's going to be largely up to the voters to decide if it should be taxed or not. And this is our best attempt to put it out to the voters. So currently we have no open questions. The time is 6:49. There is another question. It says, are cities seeing a pattern with an increase in homelessness? David, do you have any information? I do not on specific to cannabis. I do on homelessness overall, but not specific to just homelessness as a result of cannabis. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's no correlation specifically to that, just a trend of, lack of housing and other issues of regarding homeless. That's a whole different topic, but I don't think there's a specific pattern related to cannabis stores since they can't access it.
Yes, I would agree. I've seen a number of just studies or just reports regarding homelessness across the state, really across the West Coast. It's a growing issue. It's been a growing issue for a number of years. There's a lot of issues obviously associated with homelessness. Some of it's mental health, some of it's lack of employment, some of it's the reduction of diversion programs. So there's not, I don't believe that there's a one size fits all approach when it comes to homelessness. Different people are homeless for different reasons. But I have not seen a report that directly correlates cannabis sales with homelessness. However, if there is one out there, I would ask if anyone runs across one, if you wouldn't mind sharing it, that would be really good for us to have. Question, how much will it cost the city of Madera to properly enforce the ordinance? David, on the enforcement side, you have a lot more experience because we don't have an ordinance. Do you have a thought?
Right. So again, we say the ordinance tonight is on the tax itself. On Measure R, if they're referencing an ordinance that is not part of this conversation or hasn't been discussed because policy folks have not made a discussion of what would be or be permitted, it's hard to tell or have that conversation until that policy direction or decision is made, if it's made at all.
Okay. And then in the spirit of transparency, for the preparation of Measure R, the city we have a contract with David's firm HDL for up to $30,000. So it's a not to exceed number. So the most that the city will be paying David is up to $30,000. We have expended some money on our attorney. Unfortunately, I don't have that figure in front of me, but the city does have a contract attorney. So we have paid some legal counsel, some fees for that. It's not in the tens of thousands, but again, unfortunately, I do not have that number at my fingertips. And to put it on the ballot, we do not have a final cost for that, but in preliminary discussions with our elections office, that is going to range anywhere between about $80,000 to $95,000, and that figure is going to be determined by the number of ballots and registered voters. So again, that number I do not have. We will have it, but I'm in constant communication with our elections office, with Becky Martinez, and she is going to provide a number. So the two numbers that are a little more certain are HDL fees, which again are not to exceed $30,000. The fee to place it on the ballot, which there's a range there that I provided, and then there is some staff time associated with it. Obviously, myself, Mark, we have Joseph on the call as well, and then we also have Gabriella. So there are so there is city staff time involved with this, but that just provides a flavor of some of the costs associated with it. Any other questions from the attendees? So as we're waiting for any more questions, I'll begin to wrap this up. So again, I believe a lot of the people here have our information. If you want to reach out directly, I would encourage you to do so. The goal of city staff is to provide accurate information and to make sure that the voters feel that they're informed. We aren't going to try to hide anything, and we're not going to, again, either encourage or discourage people how to vote on Measure R. It's completely up to the voters. The presentations that we did this evening, the PowerPoints, we will put those on our Measure R landing page on our website. So those will be available. And if you have any follow-up questions or want to talk about this issue, feel free to reach out. If you have any questions for David, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be sure that I put you in contact with David. I'm not seeing any more open questions. Looks like Mark is waving to someone there, but I think we're okay.
I was waving off somebody that came in my office.
Okay, so with that, I would like to thank everyone for attending. Again, we have 2 more of these organized currently. If anyone in the community feels as though we are missing a segment of the community, please let us know. Our goal is to inform as many people as we can about these meetings, or if they simply want to reach out. So with that being said, I'm not seeing any other open questions. Thank you very much for attending this evening. I appreciate it. The city appreciates it. And have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everyone.